The apartment was quiet. She had left that morning, suitcase in hand, her eyes avoiding mine, lips pressed into that thin line she always used when she was about to say something serious. "I need some space to figure out what I really want," she had said, her voice trembling just slightly, though she tried to hide it. I nodded, said, "Take all the time you need, because what else could I say?" My heart pounded against my ribs like a frantic drum, but I kept my face calm, smiled, even kissed her cheek. It felt like saying goodbye to a part of myself, but I buried that feeling deep. Somewhere, I told myself she would never find. The silence that followed her departure was almost deafening. I wandered through the apartment, my fingers brushing against the edges of objects that suddenly seemed alien, her favorite mug, the throw pillow she always arranged with obsessive care, the little stack of books she read only on rainy days. I thought I knew this place, our home, but now it felt like a stage set for a story I wasn't part of. And maybe I wasn't. That thought gnawed at me, unrelenting, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to consider the cracks I'd ignored. The subtle withdrawal, the secret glances at her phone, the laughter with friends I wasn't invited to. None of it was dramatic, not on its own, but together they painted a picture I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I poured a cup of coffee, too bitter, and sat by the window. Outside, the city moved with relentless normalcy, people hurrying to work, dogs barking at morning walkers, taxis honking like they owned the world. And yet, inside me, the world had tilted. Everything seemed simultaneously fragile and infinite. I replayed her words over and over. Space. Figure out what she really wants. What did that even mean? Did she mean me, or did she mean herself? Did it even matter anymore? Hours passed, measured only by the shadows stretching across the floor. I went through our photos, the ones we had carefully chosen to hang on the walls, smiling faces at beaches, dinners where she wore that red dress I adored, mornings when we made pancakes together and laughed at our own clumsiness. Each picture felt like a relic from another life, one that existed before I realized how little control I had over my own heart. I touched one frame, traced her smile with my finger, and felt a pang so sharp it made me catch my breath. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The apartment seemed to hold its own memory of her. Every sound, every whisper of movement, a reminder that she was out there, figuring herself out, while I sat here, stationary, invisible in my own life. And that's when the idea started to take root, thought I had buried under layers of fear and politeness for too long. What if I didn't wait? What if I took control of my own destiny while she searched for hers? The plan was simple in my mind, elegant even. I would move forward, claim what I needed without hesitation, without apology. I knew what I wanted: clarity, independence, freedom, and, suddenly, the thought of selling our apartment, the one she had adored as much as I did, felt like the first step toward it. Not out of malice, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I had to reclaim the parts of myself I had left dormant in her shadow. I started researching that night. Listings, real estate agents, paperwork I had always ignored. The apartment was small, yes, but it had been ours. Memories were embedded in the walls, in the floorboards, in the kitchen cabinets. But that didn't make it mine to keep frozen in time. By the next morning, I had contacted an agent, set up meetings, and drafted the first message. I would leave her a letter that would explain everything. I didn't want anger. I didn't want confusion. I wanted truth, as jagged and raw as it might be. Days blurred into one another. She called once, her voice soft and hesitant, asking mundane questions about bills, groceries, the little routines we had shared. I answered calmly, even kindly, each word rehearsed to mask the storm inside me. I imagined her voice, her expressions, the tiny frowns when I said something she didn't understand, and I felt a mix of guilt and exhilaration. This was the price of independence. I realized the strange, intoxicating mixture of liberation and regret. By the time the agent called to confirm the sale, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The apartment, our shared sanctuary, would soon belong to someone else. And yet, a sense of power washed over me, like stepping out into sunlight after years underground. I wrote the letter that night, choosing my words with surgical precision. I figured out what I want to, simply, direct. Unavoidable when I left it on the kitchen counter. I felt a surreal detachment, as if I were observing myself from the outside. I imagined her reading it, the way her eyes would widen, the way her heartbeat would accelerate, the way panic might twist her stomach into knots. And for the first time in months, I felt alive, not because I had hurt her, but because I had finally chosen myself. That evening, I sat by the window again, watching the city darken under the weight of night. The first notification buzzed on my phone, a message from her. Panic in the text, confusion, disbelief. Then another, and another, each more frantic than the last. I didn't respond. I let the messages pile up, a monument to the choice I had made. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew confrontation was inevitable, that emotions would collide like storms on the horizon. But I welcomed it. After months of being passive, of letting her decisions dictate my days, I was ready, and as the night deepened, the city quieted, I realized that the calm I had felt earlier was gone forever. Something fundamental had shifted. The fractures in our relationship were no longer just invisible cracks. They were exposed canyons, impossible to ignore, impossible to mend without acknowledgement. And in the middle of that, I found something I had almost forgotten I possessed: courage. I went to sleep with the letter still lying where I had left it, knowing that tomorrow would bring chaos, emotion, confrontation. But it also brought clarity. And for the first time in a long time, clarity felt like freedom. The next morning, the sunlight felt sharper, almost accusatory, slicing through the blinds and landing on the floor in long, golden rectangles. I hadn't slept well. The night had been a restless blur of imagined scenarios, my mind racing ahead to the moment she would return. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, folding the laundry, making breakfast, but every action felt charged, weighted with the knowledge of what was coming. The apartment, which had once been our shared sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for my own audacious act. The sale had gone through the previous evening, finalized in a flurry of signatures and notary stamps. The apartment belonged to someone else now, a couple moving in within the week, and I was left with the physical emptiness as a testament to my choices. It was liberating and terrifying all at once. I walked through the empty rooms, touching the walls, feeling the echo of memories I could no longer call my own. Each corner whispered fragments of the life we had built together: laughter over spilled wine, whispered conversations at midnight, quiet mornings where our hands would brush without thought. I thought about her constantly, imagined her reading my letter, and felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Was it guilt? Relief? Triumph? All of it, perhaps, and none of it. I had stepped out of the role of passive observer and into the center of my own story. But the cost was her shock, her fear, her inevitable anger. The messages on my phone were still flooding, in short, fragmented, desperate. Her words jumped from incredulity to pleading, oscillating between love and frustration, and I read each one carefully, letting them wash over me without responding. I wanted her to feel the reality of her choices, the weight of the space she had demanded. By mid-afternoon, I was restless. I decided to take a walk, to let the city absorb my energy and distract me from the mounting tension. The streets were alive with the hum of life, children chasing each other along the sidewalks, couples laughing in cafes, business people striding past with purpose. And yet, in the midst of this ordinary rhythm, my mind replayed the scenes I had crafted in my head, the confrontation that was inevitable, the flood of emotions when she realized she could no longer reclaim what we had shared. I thought back to our conversations before she left, how she had spoken in careful, measured tones about needing to find herself, to explore what she truly wanted. I had listened, nodded, and smiled, all the while feeling a storm gather inside me. I had pretended to understand, to empathize, but inside, I was calculating, planning, envisioning a life that wasn't beholden to her uncertainties. The audacity of my decision exhilarated me. I was no longer waiting for her approval, no longer shackled by the need to placate, to negotiate. I had acted boldly, decisively, and there was a thrill in that autonomy I had never experienced before. Evening came, and with it, the floodgates of communication opened fully. Her messages became almost frantic, a river of panic and disbelief. "How could you?" one read. "I thought we were in this together," said another. The notifications kept coming, each one a sharper edge against the fragile sense of control I had built. And yet, I remained silent. I let the storm rage without interference, allowing her to grapple with the reality I had set in motion. The night deepened, and I lit a single lamp in the corner of the living room, casting the room in a warm, intimate glow. I sat down at the small dining table, pulled out a notebook, and began to write not letters, not apologies, but thoughts, reflections, and plans for the life I intended to lead. Writing became a salve, a way to channel the turmoil into something tangible, something that was entirely mine. Each word on the page was an assertion, a declaration of independence, and a reminder that I could navigate this chaos on my own terms. Somewhere around midnight, exhaustion caught up with me. I fell into a restless sleep, dreams haunted by fragments of our shared past and the unknown future. I dreamed of her standing at the threshold of the apartment, eyes wide with disbelief, hands trembling as she tried to comprehend the reality I had created. I dreamed of the letter, lying innocently on the counter, its words simple but devastating. "I figured out what I want to." The dream felt impossibly vivid, and I awoke with my heart racing, the memory lingering as if it were a prophecy I had somehow conjured. The following days were a study in controlled chaos. I navigated the practicalities of the sale, met with movers, and began the process of transitioning into a new life, one that was untethered from the weight of shared memories. At the same time, her messages continued, a relentless reminder that actions have consequences, and that the emotional fallout of choice cannot be contained by silence alone. I read each one, sometimes aloud, feeling the tension tighten in my chest, but I did not respond. My silence became a statement in itself, a mirror reflecting the reality of the decisions she had set in motion by seeking her own. Clarity. And then, one afternoon, the unexpected happened. A friend of hers, someone I had barely met, reached out with a message that caught me off guard. She had left her ex's city, cut ties temporarily, and was planning to return earlier than expected. The realization struck me with a jolt. The confrontation I had imagined was no longer distant, it was imminent. The flood of emotions I had been bracing for was about to collide with my carefully constructed composure. I felt a mixture of anticipation, fear, and oddly, excitement. The climax of my bold decision was near, and there was no turning back as I prepared myself for her return. I wandered through the apartment one last time, touching surfaces, remembering moments, acknowledging the life that had been ours but was no longer. I felt a strange sense of closure, a quiet affirmation that whatever happened, Netzgar, heartbreak, reconciliation, it would unfold on terms I had chosen. And in that, there was an almost intoxicating sense of power. I was no longer a bystander in my own life. I had stepped into the role of author, of architect, of force. The city outside seemed to hold its breath with me, the streets quieting as evening approached, shadows stretching long across pavements. And as the first hints of night descended, I settled into the calm before the storm, knowing that soon our worlds would collide, emotions would ignite, and the consequences of my choices would demand their reckoning. The morning she returned, the air felt charged, heavy with unspoken tension. I was in the apartment, waiting or, perhaps just observing the clock, counting down the minutes until reality would arrive on my doorstep. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. My phone vibrated incessantly on the counter, a relentless drum of notifications that I ignored deliberately. Each message was a plea, a demand, a burst of panic. I had anticipated her reaction, rehearsed it in 1,000 variations in my mind, but the actual confrontation, I knew, would be something entirely different, messy, unpredictable, raw. When she walked through the door, I was standing in the living room, calm on the surface, my heart hammering beneath my chest. She froze at the threshold, her eyes scanning the apartment, her gaze landing on the counter where the letter had once lain. The realization dawned on her slowly, painfully, and in that moment, I saw the storm I had imagined reflected in her eyes: anger, confusion, disbelief, and something else, something more complicated. Hurt, yes, but also a fragile recognition of the truth she had forced me to confront. We were no longer operating in the same story. Her voice broke first, sharp and trembling. How could you? The words were almost incoherent, a mixture of accusation and incredulity. I remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of the question settle between us. The silence spoke volumes, louder than any explanation I could offer. She stepped further into the apartment, her movements hesitant, as if navigating a space that had once been intimate but now belonged to another narrative entirely. I did what I had to. I said finally, my voice steady but not unkind. You wanted space? You said you needed to figure out what you want. I did the same. I chose to act instead of waiting. Her eyes widened, disbelief giving way to a dawning understanding. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, trying to reconcile the person she knew with the one standing before her, someone who had stepped fully into their own power, who had claimed agency where she had left uncertainty. Tears formed at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. I didn't expect this, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I thought you'd wait. I thought we'd talk, work through it. Her hands trembled, and for a moment I almost reached out to touch her, to bridge the chasm between us. But I stopped. This was not about mercy, not about softening the blow. This was about clarity, about truth, about standing in the consequences of our choices. The conversation that followed was a collision of emotions. Words spilled over one another, pleas, accusations, confessions, realizations. She asked why I hadn't called, why I hadn't warned her, why I had taken what we shared and transformed it into something entirely new without her input. I explained calmly, honestly, detailing the months of reflection, the quiet moments of realization, the longing for autonomy that had built to a crescendo she had never anticipated. I didn't expect forgiveness. I didn't want it. I wanted acknowledgement, understanding, the simple recognition that we had both changed, and that my decision was a reflection of necessity, not malice. Hours passed as we navigated the turbulent waters of emotion. The apartment, once a shared haven, felt charged with electricity, each corner echoing memories and choices alike. We spoke of love, of desire, of dreams that no longer aligned, and through it all, I realized that clarity was a double-edged sword. It freed me, but it also cut deep. It demanded honesty in a way that left neither of us untouched by the evening. Exhaustion settled over us, a quiet reprieve after the storm. She sat on the edge of the couch, head in hands, breathing ragged but steadying. I remained standing, observing, giving space, understanding that the reconciliation of hearts was not guaranteed, that some rifts could not be fully mended, but that truth, in all its jagged glory, was better than illusion. I don't know what comes next, she whispered finally, voice softer, tinged with vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I need time. I nodded, understanding perfectly. Time was the one thing we both needed, and perhaps the one thing that could never be shared fully. Take all the time you need, I said, echoing her own words from weeks before. With no trace of irony, only clarity. She stood, approached the doorway, paused, and turned back once. I don't hate you, she said, the confession hanging in the air like fragile glass. I just didn't expect this. And then she was gone, leaving behind a silence that was both heavy and liberating. I felt the weight of her absence, but also the exhilaration of self-possession. The knowledge that I had claimed my own story, my own future, without compromise. In the days that followed, the apartment remained empty of her presence, but alive with possibility. I walked through each room, not as a shadow of our shared past, but as a person fully inhabiting my own narrative. The letters, the messages, the chaos of confrontation, all of it became part of a tapestry that was mine alone. I realized that love, even when it ends or transforms, is not only about attachment. It is about courage, about the willingness to face truth, about claiming the self in the midst of uncertainty. And though the echoes of her footsteps would linger in my mind for months to come, I knew, with a certainty that was almost startling, that I had discovered not only who she was in the context of our story, but who I had always been when left to my own devices. And in that discovery, there was freedom.